Though violent crimes as a whole tend to have a greater impact on a society's sense of safety compared to other types of offenses, it's difficult to think of any crimes that can weigh on the public psyche quite like those of an unidentified serial killer. When a perpetrator like this continues to remain at large, not only does it threaten our collective sense of security, it can also affect our fundamental faith in the justice system, as we struggle to believe that anyone responsible for such brutal actions could avoid facing punishment. However, in rare cases, this is precisely what happens. For any number of reasons, multiple killings linked to a single offender can go unsolved, allowing a serial killer to walk free. Today, we wanted to take a look at a few examples of such cases, focusing on murders believed to be committed by serial killers who managed to get away with their crimes. Just a heads up, we have done a previous video on these types of crimes that covers more well-known examples of unidentified serial killers, so check that video out as well if you want to learn more. We'll be sure to leave a link in the description for anyone interested. While you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this, making sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest videos. With that out of the way, here are 5 more serial killers who got away with it. Between March and December of 1985, 3 widely publicized double homicides took place in remote areas of Washington state. The crimes came to be known as the Tube Sock Killings. While there are good reasons to doubt whether any of these cases are linked, let alone the work of a single person, the belief that an unknown serial killer was responsible has long been attributed to the murders. Because of this, we decided to include the story as a bonus on today's list. The infamous crimes began on the weekend of March 9th, when engaged couple Edward Smith and Kimberly Levine set out for a weekend getaway in their car. They drove 3 hours away to Grant County, planning to explore the surrounding tourist landmarks. Little else is known about what happened during the fateful trip. Other than that, it ended in tragedy. The following day, the body of Edward Smith was found in a gravel pit near the Wanapum Dam. His hands had been bound behind his back, and his throat had been slashed. Kimberly was nowhere to be found. Sadly, her remains were discovered 5 months later, 2 miles from where Edward's body was located. Things grew more unsettling when that same month, another couple, Stephen Harkins and Ruth Cooper, went missing during a weekend camping trip in Pierce County. 4 days later, hikers discovered Stephen's body at the couple's campsite. He had died of a single gunshot wound to the head, his body still inside of his sleeping bag. A little over 2 months later, Ruth's remains were also recovered. A tube sock was found tied around her neck. A curious detail, considering her cause of death was later determined to be a gunshot wound to the abdomen. Due to the similarities between the Smith and Levine case and the Harkins and Cooper case, investigators believe the double homicides could be linked and that they might be dealing with a serial killer. A third case seemed to confirm law enforcement's worst suspicions when on December 12th, another couple, Mike Reimer and Diana Robertson, disappeared while on a camping trip in Pierce County. The disappearances were discovered when their 2-year-old daughter Crystal, who had been with them on the trip, was found 30 miles away from where the couple had planned to go camping, standing outside of the entrance of a Kmart. Chillingly, when asked where her mother was, the 2-year-old responded that, quote, "Mommy was in the trees." Over 2 months after the disturbing disappearance, the body of Diana Robertson was found half buried in the snow near a logging road off of Washington State Route 7. She had been stabbed 17 times, and was also found with a tube sock tied around her neck. Near the body, investigators discovered Mark Reimer's red 1982 Plymouth pickup truck. Inside was a note on the dashboard that read, "I love you, Diana." In addition to the note, bloodstains were found on the vehicle's seats. Unlike in the previous cases, Mark Reimer's remains were not found in the months following the discovery of the first body. This led to speculation that he might have been behind Diana's murder, and may have even been responsible for the other killings. It would take until 2011 to finally find Reimer's remains, though by this time a cause of death could not be determined, and it was not clear whether the death was a homicide or a suicide. All that could be said was that he had not died of a gunshot wound to the head. Unfortunately, the discovery offered little in the way of conclusive answers as to whether Reimer was a perpetrator or a victim. Another major factor complicated the narrative of the tube sock killer. In 1989, the murders of the killer's first alleged victims, Edward Smith and Kimberly Levine, were actually solved. A single fingerprint on their car was traced back to a truck driver named Billy Ray Ballard Jr., a man who was already serving time for the abduction and sexual assault of 2 women in Wyoming. Ballard was charged in the double homicide case and pled guilty. However, there was no additional evidence or indication that he was involved in the other 2 double murder cases. To this day, it is unknown whether the tube sock killings were indeed the work of a serial killer, and what, if any, role Mark Reimer may have played. In the mid-1980s, women began to disappear in the Connecticut River Valley, along Route 91 near the border of New Hampshire and Vermont. First was 17-year-old Bernice Courtemanche, a nurse's aide from Claremont, New Hampshire, who went missing on May 30th, 1984, while hitchhiking to her boyfriend's house. 2 months later, a woman named Ellen Fried vanished shortly after calling her sister at a payphone on the western side of the city. Almost a year after that, a single mother named Eva Morse went missing, just a short drive south of Claremont in the town of Charleston. By the third disappearance, police knew they had a serious problem on their hands, and pretty soon, the bodies began piling up. One by one, the missing women were found dead. The remains of Ellen Fried were found September 19, 1985, in a wooded area next to the Sugar River in Kellyville. Just a few months later in 1986, the skeletal remains of Bernice Courtemanche were also found. Though both bodies were severely decomposed, investigators were able to determine they had both died from multiple stab wounds. And just 6 days after that, the remains of Eva Morse were discovered. Her body had been dumped in the nearby town of Unity. She had also died from multiple stab wounds. While investigators scrambled to figure out who was behind the crimes, they came to a startling realization. Not only were they dealing with a serial killer, these may not have even been the killer's first victims. Based on the similar locations and MO of the crimes, it was determined that 2 previous cold cases, the murders of Kathy Milliken and Mary Elizabeth Critchley, were likely related to this recent string of murders. Even more alarmingly, the killer showed no signs of slowing down, as 36-year-old Linda Moore became the next victim to fall prey to the brutal killer. Moore was killed during a home invasion just before the body of Eva Morse was discovered. Though the murder was a break from the killer's usual pattern, investigators were convinced it was related to the other unsolved cases. When he struck again several months later, he returned to this usual pattern, abducting 36-year-old Barbara Agnew before killing her and dumping her body in a wooded area. The killer would emerge only one final time, in the spring of 1988, when he attempted to murder a woman named Jane Borowski. Borowski was 7 months pregnant at the time of the attack, and though she sustained 27 stab wounds, she was able to crawl back to her car and drive to a friend's house. Miraculously, both she and her unborn baby survived. Despite the details Borowski was able to give to police, investigators never managed to gather sufficient evidence to uncover the identity of the Connecticut River Valley killer. Though a handful of suspects have emerged over the years, so far none have been charged in connection with the case. On July 3, 1988, the body of 30-year-old Deborah Medeiros was found in Freetown, Massachusetts, on the side of the highway, just over 30 feet from the road. She was partially clothed and had been strangled to death. Sadly, she would be just the first of 10 other women who went missing between 1988 and 1989, believed to be the victim of an unidentified serial killer. That person would come to be known as the New Bedford Highway Killer. The highway killer targeted women struggling with drug addiction or involved in sex work in New Bedford, Massachusetts, murdering them and leaving their bodies in nearby towns along State Highway Route 140. Though police were initially slow to realize that they were dealing with a possible serial killer, by November of 1988, it was clear that several women in the area were missing, and that bodies were beginning to pile up. In all, the remains of 9 women would be discovered, while 2 others who went missing at the same time were never found. The string of murders terrified the local community, putting immense pressure on law enforcement to deal with a rapidly declining feeling of public safety. At one point, more than 30 full-time investigators were committed to the case. However, several factors complicated the search for the New Bedford highway killer. First was the lack of evidence at the crime scenes. The killer had left behind little in the way of clues, and the time it took for many of the victims to be found meant that the bodies were badly decomposed, and the crime scenes had usually been contaminated by wild animals. Identification of the victims was also an issue. The crimes took place before widespread electronic access to fingerprint records, and even the technology that was available was slow, cumbersome, and extremely limited. Lastly, there were no eyewitnesses in any of the disappearance cases. Eventually, interviews that police conducted with women involved in the local drug and prostitution scene led them to their most promising suspect in the case, a man named Kenneth Ponte. Ponte was a reformed heroin addict who had gone to law school and who at the time was making a living with low-level civil and criminal cases. He was known to be a major cocaine user and knew many of the women who had been killed. Several of the women police talked to also described Ponte's behavior as bizarre. Unlike all later suspects in the serial murders, Ponte was actually indicted for one of the killings, that of 28-year-old Rochelle Dapierola. Ponte had represented the young woman in court shortly before she had gone missing. However, charges against him were later dropped due to a lack of evidence. It would not be the last time Ponte was investigated in the New Bedford case. Decades later in 2009, the driveway of his former home was dug up with a backhoe, but no evidence linking him to any crime was discovered. He died of a drug overdose just a year later. Perhaps the most bizarre theory in the case is that the New Bedford highway killer was the same person as the Lisbon Ripper, who killed at least 3 sex workers in Portugal between 1992 and 1993. Because of the large Portuguese community in New Bedford, it was theorized that the killer may have committed the crimes there before returning to Portugal and killing again. The lead was investigated both by the FBI and the Portuguese authorities, but ultimately never panned out. More than 30 years later, the identity of the New Bedford highway killer remains a mystery, leaving no closure for the friends and families of the victims. On February 2, 2009, a woman walking her dog found a human bone on the West Mesa of Albuquerque, New Mexico. The area is an elevated landmass in the desert, west of the Rio Grande, that stretches from the south of Albuquerque north to the nearby town of Bernalillo. As police began to excavate the location where the bone was found, they made a truly disturbing discovery. This was not just a single set of human remains. Over a period of weeks, the decomposed bodies of 11 women were found buried in shallow graves, scattered over a 92-acre swath of the West Mesa, owned by a home developer. The plot had originally been slated for residential development in 2006, but the 2008 housing collapse had interfered with that plan. Because of the advanced state of decomposition of the bodies, medical examiners were unable to determine the exact cause of death of any of the women, aside from declaring that they resulted from homicidal violence. However, they were able to determine that one of the women had been 4 months pregnant at the time of her death. After a year of investigation, police were able to establish the identities of all 11 victims. Most were found to be Hispanic women between the ages of 15 and 32, with the exception of 15-year-old Solania Edwards. Aside from being the only black victim, Edwards was the only woman not believed to be involved in sex work, and was the sole victim from outside of New Mexico. All 11 women had gone missing between the years of 2001 and 2005. Satellite images of the vast crime scene taken between the years of 2003 and 2005 showed tire marks and patches of disturbed sand and dirt where the bones were recovered. Ultimately, though, police had little to go on. There was no forensic evidence at the scene and no witnesses. However, the shared graves led police to the conclusion that there was a single person behind all of the killings, and the suspect came to be known as the West Mesa Bone Collector. In the years since the discovery of the bodies, police have considered a handful of suspects in the case, but conclusive evidence has been hard to come by. Some believe that due to the delay in finding the bodies, investigators may have missed their window of opportunity to catch the serial killer, who may have since moved on to a different state entirely. The mystery of the West Mesa Bone Collector remains possibly the most disturbing unsolved case in Albuquerque's history. On February 15, 1976, 12-year-old Mark Stebbins failed to return home from the local American Legion Hall in Ferndale, Michigan. His body was found 4 days later, lying in a snowbank in the parking lot of an office building. He had been strangled and sexually abused. The case would be the first of at least 3 other brutal child murders to take place in Oakland County, Michigan in the coming months. Next was the murder of 12-year-old Jill Robinson, following her disappearance on December 22nd of that year. Her body was also discovered after 4 days, along Interstate 75. She was found fully clothed and had died from a shotgun blast to the face. When 10-year-old Christine Mileck's body was discovered roughly 3 weeks later after yet another presumed abduction, police began to believe that they were dealing with a serial killer. This was all but confirmed after the murder of 11-year-old Timothy King, who was kidnapped sometime after taking a trip to his local drugstore on the evening of March 16th. Like Mark Stebbins, Timothy had also suffered sexual abuse and died from strangulation. A task force led by Michigan State Police was formed to investigate the brutal killings, incorporating officials from 13 communities in Oakland County. During their investigation, the task force followed more than 18,000 tips related to the crimes, becoming the largest investigation of its kind in U.S. history at the time. Authorities were able to construct a composite sketch of the perpetrator based on the statements of several witnesses. The witnesses believed they had seen Timothy King talking to an unknown man in the drugstore parking lot on the night of his disappearance. A few weeks after Timothy's disappearance, the investigation took a strange turn when a letter was received by a psychiatrist working with the task force. The letter writer used the alias Alan and said that he was the sadomasochist slave of a man named Frank, who was behind the killings. The poorly written letter stated that the two men had been traumatized by their time in Vietnam, and that Frank had committed the serial murders because he wanted rich people to suffer the way that troops had during the war. Though attempts were made to arrange a meeting with Alan, he ultimately failed to show up and was never heard from again. The frantic search for the Oakland County child killer continued until the end of 1978, when the task force was disbanded and the investigation was turned over to state police. For decades, there were few major developments in the case. The most promising lead came decades later, when in 2012, hairs discovered in the vehicle of a man named Arch Edward Sloan were found to be a match to those discovered with the bodies of Mark Stebbins and Timothy King. Sloan was already serving a life sentence for the sexual assault of a 10-year-old boy in 1985, but had long been a suspect in the Oakland case because he had lived in Oakland County at the time of the murders. Frustratingly, the hairs were not a match to Sloan himself. It is believed that Sloan may have been involved in the murders in some capacity, or else had loaned his car to the true perpetrator. However, since the initial announcement of the new DNA evidence, little else has happened in the case. The identity of the Oakland County child killer remains a mystery. The South Pacific Railroad killings, sometimes known as the Voodoo Murders, or by the more antiquated phrase, the Mulatto Axe Murders, is one of the most bizarre and confusing stories of serial murder in the 20th century. Taking place between 1909 and 1912 in Louisiana and Texas, in communities along the Southern Pacific Rail line, the brutal axe murders would claim the lives of somewhere between 17 and 49 people from black and mixed-race families. While some answers exist in the case, there are clearly far more questions, both about what exactly transpired, as well as about the case's central figure, a young black woman named Clementine Barnabet. The gruesome string of murders is thought to have began in late 1909, when a woman named Edna Opelousas and her 3 children were murdered in Rayne, Louisiana. However, it would be a little over a year before the authorities really took notice of the killings, when a second brutal crime rocked the neighboring community of West Crowley. In January of 1911, police were told by neighbors of the Byers family they feared something terrible had taken place at their home. When officers arrived, these suspicions were confirmed when Walter Byers, his wife, and his 6-year-old son were found murdered in bed. The room was an inescapable mess of blood, covering the bed, the floors, and filling a wash bucket in one of the corners. An axe stood by the head of the bed. The papers called the murders, quote, the most brutal in the history of this section. However, they were far from over. Just a month later, another brutal axe murder took place in Lafayette, claiming the lives of 4 members of the Andrews family. By this time, many people began connecting the dots. The local newspaper reported that the killings, as well as the 2 previous crimes, quote, may be the work of the same terrible monster. Following the killing of another entire family in San Antonio, Texas, police began to focus on a man named Raymond Barnabet, after his mistress had suggested to a friend that he could be behind the murders. Raymond was a sharecropper in Lafayette and was known to be a petty criminal. At his trial in October of 1911, his children, Zephyrin and Clementine, testified against him. However, as Raymond sat in jail, the murders continued. In late November, the Randall family of Lafayette were brutalized in an almost identical fashion to the previous crimes. The only difference was that Norbert Randall, the father of the family, had been shot in the head. This time, police arrested Clementine and Zephyrin Barnabet, whom they'd previously suspected were more involved in the crimes than they'd let on. Clementine in particular seemed to have a connection to the murders, when clothes in her room were found covered in blood and human remains. However, even after Clementine's arrest, the murders didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to increase in frequency. In January of 1912 alone, 3 more families were murdered. In one particularly gruesome slaying in Lake Charles, Louisiana, a chilling message was left written on the wall. The sentence was a modified Bible verse that read, "When he maketh the inquisition for blood, he forgetteth not the cry of the humble." The message was signed, Human 5. From here, the story becomes full of unreliable information and speculation. The press began to circulate stories not only that multiple murderers were working together to commit the crimes, but that the crimes might be part of a voodoo ritual involving human sacrifice. There were rumors that Clementine Barnabet was the leader of a cult called the Church of Sacrifice. The voodoo angle of the story in particular caught on like wildfire, and it became difficult to separate fact from fiction in the case. For instance, stories about the so-called Church of Sacrifice never led anywhere concrete. The man who supposedly led the church, a Pentecostal revival preacher named Reverend King Harris, had never heard of any such religious cult. By all accounts, Harris was a completely normal preacher, and according to police, was distraught even at the idea that his sermons could have inspired the brutal axe murder spree. Then, there was Clementine Barnabet's own account, which could hardly be trusted. Though she would eventually confess to 35 axe murders, even saying that she had bought a voodoo charm that she believed would protect her while committing the crimes, she could never keep her story straight. Names she provided of supposed accomplices in the crimes were investigated by police but went nowhere, and it was difficult for many to believe anything that Clementine said. Indeed, it was impossible for her to have committed all of the crimes, as her time in jail during the serial murders proved. Still, the stories of voodoo and cult worship were well ingrained in the minds of the public by this time, and Clementine Barnabet was eventually given a life sentence for the crimes. Strangely enough, though, she was released after only 10 years. While it is difficult to know what to make of the story, it is clear that a killer or even several killers responsible for the brutal axe murders were never identified in the crimes that took place along the Southern Pacific Rail line. Even more disturbing, they were accompanied by another series of unsolved serial axe murders in Louisiana by a perpetrator who was dubbed the Axeman of New Orleans. While the cases have never been officially connected, it remains yet another bizarre layer in this truly mysterious crime. That brings us to the end of our list. Are there any other cases like this that you think we missed? Let us know in the comments section below. As always, if you enjoyed our video, don't forget to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this, making sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest videos. Thank you for watching.